So also I'm here to present today's speaker. As Rajesh said, we're going to talk about the conflict transformation approach. And for that, I'm welcoming Carolyn Williams. Carolyn is an international peace builder, researcher, advocate, and strategic advisor working with civil society, NGOs, academic institutions, governments, the private sector, and the UN system to increase capacity and achieve inclusive, sustainable, and positive peace. Caroline is considered an expert in conflict transformation and youth and gender sensitive peace building, including YPS or Youth Peace and Security and WPS or Women Peace and Security Policy agendas. She is particularly interested in leveraging partnerships for systems change and transformation on local and global scales. So, Caroline, welcome. Thank you for being with us here today, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Matias and Ravesh. It's so nice to meet you and everyone who's here. It looks like we have a very international crowd as always. So I'll just say hello, konnichiwa, hola, good morning, good evening. I don't know what time it is for all of you, but when I was in undergrad, I had a meeting with my professor and he said, Carolyn, one day all your personal projects, you're going to do them between 1 in the morning and 3 in the morning. And I thought he was kidding, but it's 2:15 in the morning here in the US where I am. So I guess he was right. So all your late night studying will not be forgotten once you hit the career world. So just first to say, it's so amazing what you're doing. I know you don't need another fan club, but just thank you for the efforts that you're leading. Thank you for caring in the first place. But this issue of positive peace, it needs to move so much more beyond just these academic spaces. So I'm so happy to hear you all using these terms in such a normal way and in social settings as well as academic settings. Like the more we can just get this into people's usual, normal, everyday language, the further and farther we're going to get. So thanks for what you're doing. Thanks for this invitation. I could share so many different things. I've prepared a few different frameworks about conflict transformation just to give us kind of like the ABCs to work with. And then you'll take that and apply it in the way that makes sense for you in your work and in your lives. But I just want to say, or maybe give you a quick story about how this all intersects, at least in my life and linking to where you all are coming to from. So when I was doing my bachelor's study in peace and conflict, the focus was actually peace and conflict resolution. That was the term. It was not transformation at the time, it was resolution. And we'll get into a little bit of that. I have a book recommendation. It's called The Little Book of Conflict Transformation. And I promise you it's little. It's like really this big, and you can even get it free online. So beyond that, it is free and available. But it's a super academic approach. The author is called John Paul Lederach. He's a major author in this space of conflict transformation. And the whole focus is on the true difference, academically speaking, between conflict resolution and conflict transformation. So because that is free and available, and I really respect the work of Professor Lederach, I'm not going to go into the details. I'm going to leave it with you all, but I'll pull some of that out into this whole piece. But zooming out from there back into personal experience, just thinking to the days of having a club, and a club that was for your interest and something that you wanted to do. It's not for nothing. I just want to say that you probably heard about 2250 and you learned about the Youth Peace and Security Agenda. And so UN Security Council Resolution 2250, which came out in 2015, was actually prefaced by 1 to 5 years of advocacy in groups just like this. Just like this. I was sitting at American University at the Center for Global Peace. We had a journal there called the Journal for Peace Building and Development. I was like an unpaid intern, then I got paid internship, and it was just young people that cared about peace, sustainability, systems change. We didn't have that word yet. I think maybe cross-fertilization of knowledge is where we were at in 2011. There wasn't this concept yet of systems change really bubbling on campuses back then. And so when I was with the Center for Global Peace and the Journal for Peacebuilding and Development, I met other young people that cared about these things and were going to courses with me on conflict resolution. And I met this organization called Search for Common Ground. And Search for Common Ground is a great international nonprofit. And they led a lot of the work, a lot of the adult-led work in peace building was kicked off by Search for Common Ground. So I started working with them back in 2012. And so at that time, Search for Common Ground was one of the organizations that was firmly coming out and saying, youth need to have a seat at the table. And I know this doesn't sound crazy. Then that was like, what? Young people should come to a meeting? They should get name tags? They should sit next to these adults in suits? Like, no way. This was really groundbreaking. I know that sounds so pathetic now, which is so great, right? It's so great that we've come this far, that it's normal. But it was really like what did they say? Like, you got to break down the door. Obviously not, because we lead with nonviolence, and this is not how we get invited into these spaces. We need to convince people, and we need to convince the power holders and the gatekeepers why young people not only should be at the table, right? Because we have creative ideas and all this brilliance, but that it's a right, and that young people deserve that space and have valuable contributions to make. So all that to say, this was a big, great debate, and young people really wanted a voice and wanted that recognition, and figured that international advocacy was actually the best way to do that. So all these kind of local people trying to make an effort, we linked up. We had an enormous WhatsApp group of like 500 people, and trying to start to coordinate, how do we do this? How can we make real international advocacy for, this, what would become the youth peace and security agenda? At the time, it was not really youth peace and security. Obviously, that came from, what do you think? It was the women peace and security agenda that had its first resolution about 10 years before the youth peace and security agenda did. So we needed to follow in the footsteps of other marginalized groups who had been successful. And so we looked at the women's movement, because of course, much like young people, in all of our diversity, women are also considered a monolith, right? Women and girls, youth, women, youth, and girls. Okay, let's put them all like they're this one thing, instead of recognizing that everyone has, right, unique capacities and needs. And anyways, we say in American English, preaching to the choir, which basically means you're like saying things to people that you don't need to convince. You're all the positive peace group. But anyways, the reason why I'm saying all of this is because what you're doing here matters, that you're coming together matters, and you don't know what seeds you're planting now. Like, really, I've been thinking about, what is conflict transformation really about? What do I want to communicate? And it really is so simple as like, what else transforms in this world? We as human beings, it's like you're the same, but you're different. That's all it is. So you're planting these seeds of transformation right now. You don't know what it could grow into. I didn't know in 2012, sitting in this small nonprofit office, working for no money at all, wondering, could I even make a career in this field? And then I get invited to a meeting in New York City at the UN Peacebuilding Fund. And they say, okay, we want to have young people at the table. Won't pay for your bus ticket. We won't pay for it, right? So you have to figure it out. You have to figure out, how do you get your bus ticket? How are you going to afford food when you go to this city to do your advocacy? These are all things that as peace activists and young people, you need to figure out. But it was just a huge opportunity that the UN would even give a young person a badge to go into the headquarters office and sit at the table. But at that table at that time were mostly youth serving organizations. Now we talk about youth led, right? Or then it was like youth focused. And so the youth focused organizations, it wasn't, 50%. It wasn't Positive Peace Society of Hiroshima. It wasn't any of these groups. It was the major organizations out there in the world, like Girl Scouts, Save the Children, excellent voices. I think we can all agree, very great actors in this space doing great work. But are they youth led? No. They're youth sensitive, they're youth inclusive, all of this sort of thing. But there was not actual youth leadership in this youth peace building space. And so what happened was these guiding principles for youth peace and security got created. In actuality, the term was guiding principles for young people's participation in peace building. I tried to look them up so I could share it with you, and the internet just moves too quickly because it was before 2016. It's no longer available online. So I'll see if I can find it, because it's interesting just to look at what the youth activist community globally was working on in between 2012 and 2014. Then what happened when there was the Global Forum on Youth Peace and Security, which UN member states funded and supported, and I'm sure you went through this all in the YPS webinar, so I won't get into too much detail. But essentially, all of that paved the way for Resolution 2250 to even be on the table at all. And so all this writing that young people had done, sitting in meetings like this, sending spreadsheets around to 100 of people on an email chain. I mean, you've all done this stuff. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And that's what it took. And then these other nonprofits got involved, the UN agencies got involved. And that way, slowly, the seed started getting more water. It started getting more sun. The wind started blowing in the right way. Things started growing. And then by 2015 is when, of course, this resolution passed. And the really important thing about the timing of that, and what's important for you all to think about in your advocacy, is sort of there's these leverage points in history. And right now, I think we're certainly in one. We're in a monumental moment of change, of the world realizing that our systems that were built are built for a past reality that doesn't serve most people well. And so in this great restructuring, it is really a transformation of systems. People say we want to go to scale, we want to do this, we want to do that. And it's all transformation. Like at the real core of this systems change approach of peace building, all of it is we need to transform. We need to transform ourselves. We need to transform what we have into what it is that we need, and what will support all of us in our diversity. So I'm going to shift gears kind of extremely here to just look at some frameworks, because I've now studied peace and conflict for 7 years or something like this. So I'm just going to try and condense down like some simple frameworks that are like shapes, triangles, circles, curves, just so that you have like the very 101 peace and conflict transformation academic kind of background thinking. And then that you can take that and leverage it for academic projects, for peace building projects, for advocacy. I really, really recommend strongly that if you're not already doing advocacy, which I'm sure you are because you're part of these groups, that you find other young people and other networks to do collective advocacy, for many, many reasons, not only to mention that when there's more of us, of course, the protection and safety of participation angle does change. But I've noticed through all of the years of doing this work, whether it's with nonprofits or whether it's the UN or whether it's more just kind of grassroots people that come together and want to do a project, it's peace building is like so many people do peace building and they don't know that's what they're doing, or they don't feel that they can own and say, I am a peace builder. And so I would first, I guess, love to know from each of you, and you don't need to be super participatory or anything, but how do you identify yourselves? Do you identify as a peace builder? I know at least the two folks that spoke before me have studied this, work in this. Um, does anyone feel comfortable? Like you can just unmute yourself. This doesn't need to be formal to just say like how you are involved in peace, or do you identify as a peace builder or an advocate or an activist or anything. I'm going to stop talking and I would just really love to open the floor to everyone else to say how do they relate to peace. Maybe I'll put it that way. How would you relate to peace, whether you feel you're a leader for peace or educating yourself about peace, this sort of thing. Maybe I'll ask Matthias first.
Yeah, that sounds about correct. I've wondered a whole lot about this because I think that part of the problem that leads us to have the need to talk about conflict transformation is that people usually opposes the idea, the concept of peace to war. So basically, we have been taught that you're a peace builder only if you live in an armed conflict zone area or whatever. But I've been working on this. I coordinate a project in my hometown that's called the School of Citizenship. And in the past few weeks, we have been talking about peace building and what peace means. And actually, peace is even related as something as domestic as local insecurity. Like the first thing that needs to happen for a crime to exist is that the people that's committing the crime needs to feel that's not a part of the same community as the victim. That they're not part of the same group. So that disconnection is lack of peace. So we're working right now on how to make the fabric of our community thicker and stronger in order to avoid a little bit of this. Um, but it resonates, the question resonates a lot with me, and I'm guessing a little bit with everyone because um, sometimes I believe that we have been imposed of a little bit of an imposter syndrome, and telling you you're a peace builder is like, oh no, I won't dare to say something like that.
That's such a good example. And we must dare to, because there are some real extreme people out there advocating for violence. And if they're going to come out so strong and say, I am an advocate of, no one says it that way, of course, but there are people out there that are really going extremely hard on this violence side. And so for us as activists and as pro peace and as peace builders, I'm going to keep saying it, we have to be, you don't have to be loud in people's face, but like we need to also be out there and claim it and say it because it's true. I was in the hospital with my grandmother once, and you know how doctors think in a very different way than us, maybe more creative, social working people. And so the doctor said to me, "What do you do for work?" And I said, "I want to socialize this term, right?" So I said, "I'm a peace builder." And he kind of looked at me like, that's not a real thing, is it? But I work in peace building and conflict transformation. And he kind of got quiet. And then he looked and he goes, "So what kind of pieces do you build?" Peace building. What kind of pieces do you build? And I thought, oh no, he's completely misunderstood me. He has no idea what I'm talking about. But then I thought about it and I was like, it's actually a great question. Matthias mentioned the social fabric. So what pieces are we building? The cloth of the social fabric. What else matters to peace building? Social cohesion. What else? Trust. Confident. If someone's not in your community, maybe you're less likely to defend them, or you're more likely to commit a crime. All of these things, they get back to right the basis of peace. And it really is, there's a term that gets shortened sometimes in project proposals into CBM. And what that means is confidence building mechanism. And it's basically anything. A confidence building mechanism could be this meeting we're doing right now for your group. You're building confidence amongst each other. Or it could be, like the project you're doing in your hometown, Matthias, where maybe you're going into these communities and you're having open dialogue where people can sit and talk about, what does peace mean to me? What does it feel like? What does it feel like? We did this with a group in Mexico, we asked, what does peace mean to you? And someone said, the ability to walk home to my house without having fear is peace to me. That's not the most profound definition of peace anybody's ever heard, but we don't all have to be Gandhi. We don't all have to be Nobel Prize winners. That is the meaning of peace for that person. That's what it truly means for that person, is to go home at night and not be afraid. That's peace. And if that's what I'm working for every day, that's good enough for me. Would anybody else be open to sharing either what peace means to them or how they relate to it, if they're a peace builder or a peace activist? Or any other word you like? Yeah, please.
Caroline, people often relate that they are only a peace builder if they're associated with some big institutions, right? For UN and all this, but it's not true. Like if you're starting even with a university club or very individual level, you're still contributing to peace building, right? So we just want to break this myth and, start promoting, that individual peace matters, right? So I think what we do as PPS here is also one of that approach where we encouraging, people to start speaking what you think about peace, right? And put your words out there, right? So people can know, you can be heard. Right? So that's my definition for peace building as student.
That's awesome. And thank you for your leadership on that. I think it's really brave and it's so important and it matters on a global basis in our own hearts. I mean, I think about it a lot sometimes in this approaches to conflict. I grew up thinking conflict was so bad. I'm from the US. I see that my country and my government creates a lot of conflict in the world. I've always seen conflict as such a negative word and peace as this sort of almost utopian, right? Like, oh, peace is this, in some countries, peace is also a dirty word. In some contexts, they've heard so much about the UN, so much about peace. It's like, that's a political word. That's a dirty word. I've had that said to me before in peace building. No, we can't use that word, peace. It's not good. Wait, what? My entire identity as a career has been wrapped around this. How is it not good? But it's because of these political definitions and it's this detachment. So exactly what you both are saying, being able to own that and speak it and give examples. I don't know if you all have heard about the everyday, I'm sure you have, I'm putting it in the chat, everyday peace indicators. This is a good academic example of how to just make these things more normalized. So the everyday peace indicators were basically a way to approach peace and conflict analysis with more normative research approaches. So here's for instance, you're going down a street and you notice how many houses, in the row have metal fences and their shades down at a certain time of day. And then you do that cross comparatively in different neighborhoods. And then you compare that with, violence trends, or you compare that with these other, indicators and you see, an everyday peace indicator in this neighborhood is if people have their windows open at a certain time, that's an indicator of peace. Or if they have the gates up and the window shades are down at a certain time, that's an everyday indicator of not peace or negative peace, as we would say maybe, or maybe of violence, of risk of violence. So there are these alternative approaches and alternative ways of thinking about these concepts, even violence. I'm not sure how much this is talked about in academic studies, but I've been working with an approach called the cure violence approach. And it's so transformative because it reframes violence overall. Instead of violence as something that happens, it's violence as a disease, violence as something that's contagious. And so it means that it can be cured. It means that violence has symptoms. It means that it spreads. It means that if you've grown up and witnessed violence, it's more likely to happen in your life, either for you as a perpetrator or someone in your family, because it's a contagious disease. It has symptoms, it can be tracked. And so just that shift in thinking about, okay, peace is this utopic thing. No, peace is real and we can build it. Violence is just this act of aggression that happens. No, it's a disease that's contagious and can be controlled and cured. You know, all of these things, conflict is even an opportunity. It's tragedy. I mean, the violent conflict we're seeing everywhere in the world, we don't even need to discuss it. That is horrifying. That is negative conflict. It's also an opportunity for transformation because every single conflict is an opportunity for transformation. And that's this reframing that we can do in our own minds. That's all. We don't have to be so, you know, omnipowerful. It can just be in our own minds to start. And then working even with our families. You know, this woman, Lema Bowe, she won a Nobel Peace Prize for her work in the war in Liberia. And she took a women-centered approach to have women's activism for the male political leaders in Liberia to stop the violence and stop the war. And I asked her, what is your definition of peace? Because to me, at that time in my life, peace was the absence of fear. That's how I defined peace. And she sort of said, well, you know, you can have peace and still be afraid. And so over all this time, I've determined that peace is not the absence of war, but the presence of conditions that dignify all. So, you know, like you're saying, Matthias, people are like, peace, war, it's this dichotomy and they have to exist together. This kind of separates it out or maybe complicates it more, like put in more of those shades of gray in between the black and white. And it's not just, you know, we're at peacetime or we're at wartime. It's almost this peace building is a constant process that has to be happening. But unfortunately, like with most things that make a difference and systems change, it gets left till it's too late, or when things are like a reaction, right? Instead of doing something preventative and holistic. I'm going to share some of these frameworks now. Let's see. You see this well, right? The stages of conflict. Yeah, perfect. So this is basically just what we've been talking about above, about peace building and conflict transformation, and really how everything that we do, whether it's development, whether it's peace and diplomacy work, whether it's social cohesion, it's all just part of one big wheel and they're all reinforcing. So whatever sort of career track you choose to take in this world, it can contribute along any of these cycles. So in thinking about how do we take this transformation approach to create positive peace and achieve social change? Well, if I had the answer to that, this hour webinar wouldn't need to exist. We wouldn't need a positive peace group. All of the world's problems would be solved. Someone told me once, the goal of your work in the nonprofit, right? Because we work for governments, we work for the UN, we work for NGOs, maybe we work for corporate, but for the most part, it's like a nonprofit world. And so the point is to work yourself out of a job. And I thought that was so uniquely interesting because, you know, in this capitalist, you know, constant growth, technology, explosion world, it's like, keep going, keep going, keep going. But in actuality, in peace work, if we really do our jobs well, we wouldn't be needed. And this is like the only field in the world, you know, maybe with doctors and this sort of thing, curing cancer. It's like really what our goal is to not be needed in the long term. Unfortunately, we'll be working for all of our lives, but I think it's an interesting frame to think about that our field is actually one of the few that our mission is really to work ourselves out of a job. If we could just get at the root cause of these problems, right? That's the core of conflict transformation, I would say. If I really had to boil it down into like conflict resolution or conflict transformation is about the root cause. It's really about getting to the root of the issue, because in every single, this curve that we're looking at right now, I want to be very clear. This is for international violent conflict. So this is like very academia if you were to analyze war or violent ethnic conflict, for instance. And so what we see as the yellow dots, that's what's in caps. And so the root of the conflict, there's always something before, and the root of the conflict can just exist. It can just keep existing and keep existing, and you know how roots in plants work. It'll shoot something out of the ground every now and again, but maybe it doesn't grow into a big tree yet. But if something happens, say a trigger event, that's when this conflict really can start to emerge. And so that's why we see on this U curve that it's sort of, things are plateauing, they're as normal, let's say status quo, which is not acceptable and not good. And there's all these horrible root causes of conflict bubbling underneath the surface. And then we have a trigger event. So now the conflict is known. If that's an interpersonal thing, maybe it would be an act of violence or a spoken word. Then the conflict emerges. So it's official, right? We are in a conflict situation. What tends to happen in conflicts that don't get interrupted, resolved, or transformed? Well, they continue, they spiral, there's more cost to everyone. So this is what we call spiraling, is this phase. And that's usually the phase between the outbreak of violence, so the emergence of the violent conflict, and then the point you see on the bottom there, which is in diplomacy terms called a herding stalemate. And stalemate is basically when nobody really has an option. So it's like it has gone stale. You kind of think of it like that. The situation has gone stale. No one is really taking any actions, and it's as bad as it can get. It can't get worse. And so it can be the climax of the conflict because things are worse. It's the worst that it will be. And in terms of a negotiation side, it's called herding stalemate because it's the climax of the conflict, the part that's been worst so far, and then the parties that are negotiating this peace or this conflict are having a stalemate with each other. And so the only way out is through. We know this. And so what happens from there to move up and out of this pit that has been dug into because of conflict and violence? We need to talk to each other. We need to have dialogue. We need to have mediation. You're probably noticing as you look at this that peace building is nowhere on it, right? It's nowhere on here. And so it needs to be all throughout. It needs to be here and preventative. It needs to be at the end. Usually that's where people put this. Trauma healing and peace building usually comes post-conflict. That's wrong. I mean, that's the way it was taught. That's the way it was conceptualized in this old school way of peacekeeping and peace building and peace commissions. But in terms of what actually works, we of course need peace building 24/7, 365 at all different levels of society. And that can be, youth-led, that can be all different parties can be involved. So this dialogue and mediation piece is generally an opportunity for different tracks of dialogue and mediation to happen. So if you've learned much about negotiation or peace agreements, usually this is when someone will call in either a mediator or maybe a UN negotiation team and say, we need help. And so the way the UN works is that they must be invited. And we know that invitations are complicated because there are political pressures, there's different things, but all technicalities speaking, there needs to be an invitation. So you invite, and then there's this dialogue that is facilitated either formally in a negotiation mediation environment or informally. There's different tracks. There's like track 1, 2, and 3. And so track 1 is this very formal, maybe national level. Track 2 is more informal. Maybe it's local level, or maybe it's, groups like yours. Maybe a Positive Peace Society would get together with a local group and they would start having community dialogues. And then your community dialogue could filter in. You see this a lot happening in conflicts. I'll give Syria as an example. Syria was a great example of a conflict that has been unraveling, re-emerging, right? There's been like various trigger events, and it's like this conflict spiral just keeps happening over and over again. They did get to a place though where they created a constitutional committee to negotiate a new constitution. And so that was part of the mediation and negotiation dialogue component. And what happened there, which is a first, this is a first in a peace agreement, as far as I know, I could be wrong, where there was a mandated 30% participation requirement for women and for civil society. I mean, that just really helps with this whole track 1, 2, 3 thing, because then instead of excluding the people who are typically in a track 2 or track 3, like civil society, things like this, you're bringing those voices already into the formal mediation and negotiation space. So some things like that have been changing in our field in the last 10 years that have been positive, contributions within this formal system, so to speak. So usually what comes out of this negotiation process is a resolution, right? They say, we have a peace agreement, we've agreed. But is that transformation? Not usually. It can be. It depends, right? Like all of this remains to be seen in the agreement implementation phase. But let's say everyone is at the table, they sign on. So we've resolved the conflict. We have conflict resolution. So then that usually requires that there's reconciliation, that there's healing, that there's a justice process, right? We always hear truth and justice coming together, healing and reconciliation coming together. All of those are pretty hard to do without a peace building component and without some positive peace bubbling in society, right? How do you reconcile with someone who you perceive as being from an other group or an enemy group, or someone who has harmed someone in your family? I mean, these are, if we're thinking about it in a, active conflict context setting, these are huge asks for a conflict affected community. And so that's why this peace education and leadership for peace is so important to have always, and to have as like a strength, a muscle that we're always training. Because then if a conflict situation happens, you have that strength of peace building already built into all of these phases that are very complicated. And so conflict transformation doesn't tend to happen until, the long haul, so to speak. Like a lot of people in this field start to look at things. There's a term called a time horizon. And maybe you know this in your research. So like a time horizon could be 1 year, or it could be like 30 years. And a lot of indigenous communities, their time horizon on change is huge. They see generations even. I think in the US, some native tribes say you need to look 7 generations ahead and 7 generations back. And so that's decades. This is like really thinking about things in a much different way. So just keep that in mind when you think about these stages of conflict. These are 2 other great frameworks for thinking about conflict and conflict transformation. And it's because they break it down into the very super simple. So this is Johan Galtung's triangle. I call it the ABCs. So it's basically, what are our components if we look at a conflict? And it's the attitudes of the people in the conflict, it's the behaviors of the people, and it's the context. So anytime you're looking at a conflict situation to say, how could this be transformed? You need to think about it from the behavior level, from the attitude level, and from the context level. And so that is individuals, that's groups, that's even, the community culture, things like this. And then related to that is, I don't know if you've ever thought about yourself as an onion before, but if we think about the onion, besides that it makes us cry sometimes, and that's okay, we also think about that it has layers, right? Like all of us, we have different layers. And so the most external one that people usually see is our position. And so that's when we're in an environment where we're interacting with people, we don't always know more than just that outside shell, right, of what they're showing us. And that's their position. It's what they say. And that's all we can know is what they say. And then one layer in is their interests. And that's really getting to the root cause, right? It's, why do we say what we say? Well, it's because we have interests. And why do we have interests? Well, we have needs. And, then this gets into Maslow's basic hierarchy of needs. And you build all these little frameworks in your head, and you start to understand how to analyze a conflict situation from these perspectives. So you think about the individuals, you think about the groups, understanding more and more their positions, their interests, things like this. And that's when you get to starting to understand, how do people approach conflict and why? And that's why those things before mattered, because then you can look at a graph like this and you say, oh, okay, so this person was able to compromise with me in this situation because our needs, we were able to recognize that our needs were the same. There's a definition of violence that I think is very interesting that comes from the nonviolence field, which, if any of you are very interested in peace education, I would also recommend learning more about nonviolence and nonviolent education. The definition of violence in nonviolence education is a tragic expression of an unmet need. A tragic expression of an unmet need. That's how nonviolence defines violence. And so when we think about that in the context of these two frameworks, you realize, okay, or if we go back to the root of the conflict, okay, it wasn't an unmet need, or maybe it was a miscommunicated attitude. You know, all of these things that are beneath the surface that when things get politicized, just become very difficult to approach. And the more we can have awareness of that, and awareness and empathy and compassion for all people's perspectives and positions, you can understand more, okay, how are they approaching this? How am I approaching this? And as we both increase, I don't know if you can really tell, but this is a graph. And so one axis is focused on concern for self, which basically means how much am I attached to what I want in this situation? And then the other graph is concern for others. And so that's how much do I care about the other people in this situation, more or less. And you look at it in terms of the conflict parties. And so the goal is to collaborate. That's always our goal, to have a win-win situation through collaboration. Sometimes that's easier than others. But this graph is actually the most helpful way, at least for me, to think about how to engage in conflict transformation, because you can only transform the conflict through the collaborative approach. Anything else will only get you to resolution. So it has to be a win-win in order for this conflict transformation approach to have worked. And this is what John Paul Lederach describes as the difference. So I think for sake of time, I would just focus on this question, which for conflict transformation, the question is, how do we end something destructive to build something desired? So that's sort of back to systems change too. How do we build the desired systems for positive peace?